Thank you, David, and good morning. Welcome to another edition of the Black Studies Broadcast Journal. Today, we have a very special guest on the program, Reverend Jesse Jackson, National President of Operation PUSH, People United to Save Humanity. Welcome to the Black Studies Broadcast Journal, Reverend Jackson.
Glad to be here with you today.
We have followed the progress of your involvement in various kinds of programs and efforts for the black people in this country. And I guess our audience is generally familiar with you. And why don't we introduce you more on a specific kind of basis? And would you talk to us a little bit about your background, where you born and where you went to school and so forth?
Well, I was born in Greenville, South Carolina. Textile center of the world, foothill of the mountains, called the Piedmont section. Black people, however, could not get involved in the textiles. I was brought up about 30 miles from Clemson College, about 100 miles from the University of South Carolina. And of course, I could go to neither because I was black. When I graduated from high school, however, I received a football scholarship to the University of Illinois in Champaign. Went there, and because I was black, I couldn't play quarterback. And there were so many other forms of disrespect for black people on the Illinois campus until the social immobility kind of provoked me to go back south to school at North Carolina A&T in Greensboro, North Carolina, where I feel I got a very well-rounded education as well as an opportunity to express myself. So, and that cuts across that part of it. Then I kind of grew up in the NAACP with a measure of race consciousness. By the time I got to college, I joined CORE and worked with Jim Farmer and Floyd McKissick. Then by 1965, I went away to the University of Chicago Theological Seminary, and got involved with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and with Dr. King, and was a field organizer for a while. Then I was in the Department of Fundraising, and eventually I received the Operation Breadbasket assignment. And up until December, that is what I was doing. That was my version of the ministry, the part of it I was working in. And then we started Operation PUSH, People United to Save Humanity, on Christmas Day.
Very, very rich experiences, I should say. You were at North Carolina A&T, and as many of our listeners know, that in Greensboro, North Carolina, in the late 50s and early 60s, was the scene upon which many of Dr. Martin Luther King's efforts were initiated and implemented. Were you actively involved in the sit-ins and so forth in Greensboro at that time?
Yeah, I got involved in sit-ins in 1963. 1959, and I left Illinois, I went home for Christmas. I had to do a speech that involved 25 annotated bibliographies. So I had to go to the library, went to the public library in Greenville, and I couldn't use the public library. I had to go to what was called the colored library. And that did not just mean black people sitting together. It meant, inferior material and not enough books. So I had to cut 4 days off of my Christmas vacation to go back to school, to finish my speech. Anybody who knows anything about that first college Christmas vacation, taking 4 of those days is really taking our teeth out with killing nerve. And so I was determined when I went back home, if public meant that my daddy was contributing taxes into, I was going to that library. It's interesting how ideas generate in the universe once they really arrive at their time. It was that same February, like 30 or 35 days later, that the sit-in movement actually started in Greensboro, North Carolina. Now, it was during that same spring that the black revolt was beginning to manifest itself in some small ways, even on Big Ten campuses at that time. And so it was that next fall that I transferred and went to A&T. And 2 years later, the spirit of the sit-in movement was rekindled. And that was the same year of the Birmingham movement in Alabama, the Danville, Virginia movement. Those are some of the more bloody and watershed movements of that period. But needless to say, there were about 300 cities in revolt during that summer.
Would you care to talk a bit about this man, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, of whom we've heard and read and seen You were a personal friend of his and a personal associate of him. What kind of man did you find him to be?
Well, first of all, Dr. King was an ordinary man who worked extraordinarily hard, and that is why his rewards were extraordinarily great. In one sense, one would have to say he was a good student, but he studied extraordinarily hard. Even as late as 1966, 67, Dr. King was reading a book a week, at least. So he was a very well-read man. He embodied the whole notion of the philosopher and the king, a man of wisdom and a man of power, but also a man of action. And we have a lot of people who act without information, so they don't know where they're going, and other people who have a lot of information and don't act, and so they're constipated, and they can only sit on the sideline and complain about what other people are doing. But he embodied the wisdom and the action. He put his body where his mouth and his mind was. So in one sense, he was the Word becoming flesh. He closed the gap between creed and deed. And he had he was composed of a rare combination between integrity, intelligence, and involvement. And he had a keen sense of I-ness. That is, he could not lose. He had a winner's complex, which I consider a very healthy complex. And so that was the drive, and then his brand of morality, his appreciation for a world that was dominated by moral good. That level made him, I might say, a little different from average people, because his capacity to love in the face of persecution was a bit extraordinary. But he understood the theory of the moral world, and he practiced that theory, and he became artistic at it. So I would have to say that every little child has the potential to become a Dr. Martin Luther King, but one has to understand that what made him up was academic development, integrity, involvement. That is, the more he was involved, the more he grew. I mean, he evolved from Dexter Street Church in Montgomery to taking positions against the Vietnam War. That was the evolution of his thought, but that was associated with his being involved.
Mm-hmm. What specific impact or effect did this man have upon you in shaping and molding your own outlook on life, your own activities right now?
Well, I guess the basic impact he had upon me was his worldview challenged everybody around him to broaden their minds. A lot of us have a ghetto view, some of us just have a corner view, and some people just have a national view. But he had a world view. Some of us, people will pull the world down to the size of their minds. That's why people with little minds can't occupy big positions. That is, what is happening in the evidence is evidenced by President Nixon. He's trying to pull the world down to the size of his mind. Whereas if you have persons of the caliber of John Kennedy, of the caliber of Adlai Stevenson, they tend to have a world perspective. Well, Dr. King had a world perspective. Some of us would settle for controlling the ghetto, not realizing that the ghetto is simply a community of black people within a larger community of white people. Therefore, he could say that it is good to develop black people, but you are not going to have any healthy black people that are buried within a cocoon of sick white people. Therefore, it is in everybody's best interest for everybody to get well and conclude that either we're going to live together as brothers and sisters or we're going to die apart as fools, that we're going to have nonviolence and non-existence. Well, these kind of positions grew out of his having a world view.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that had a profound kind of impact upon you, I suppose.
Yeah, well, the impact was that I could not talk about, for long, black poverty without dealing with poverty. There are between 40 and 50 million people in the country now listed as malnourished. And of the 40 million, 28 million are white. And it is not realistic and certainly not moral to assume that those 12 million blacks are going to be relieved of malnutrition without the 28 million white being relieved of it. And as a matter of fact, the chances are the 28 million white may be relieved, if it's possible, even before the 12 million blacks are. In other words, if you get a war on poverty program, it ain't because black people are poor in Harlem or Southside Chicago or Mississippi. It's because President Kennedy, made the poor white of West Virginia visible. Or if you get welfare. Welfare came into existence as a depressionary measure during the Roosevelt era, not because black folk were unemployed. I mean, unemployment for white people, 6 and 7% is considered a depression. Black folk can be unemployed 25 and 30%, and people are raising questions, are they lazy and apathetic? Well, that reflects the psycholinguistics of racism. And understanding how intricately involved poverty is and people who are trapped in it, I have to deal with the elimination of poverty and hunger and the institution of jobs, for people, because only a full employment economy will reduce the tension that grows as a result of certain people being unemployed while other people are employed. I cannot divorce my gospel here from the gospel that deals with stop the killing in Vietnam, because the money that should go to healing in America, is used for killing in Vietnam. The people who should reap the benefits and the fruits of life in America are being killed in Vietnam. If China is drawn into the war in Vietnam at a full scale, and Russia, we will have a world war. And those bombs, once they begin to drop, will wipe out the just and the unjust. And so to that extent, I have to take a view of the world, and not just of my particular area or my particular race.
Now, when you speak of poverty, and I guess this is is a concept that has been thrown around, and I guess I want to sort of zero in on specifically, are we talking about economic depression? Are we talking about the minds of people, the mental development, or just what are we referring to?
You're talking about both. Poverty is mental and physical. At the mental level, I say that we have to keep people hoping, because if people stop hoping, they stop hopping. People lose their sense of hope. You give them a job, they won't work. They go to class, they go to university, but they won't study. You give them food, they won't eat. Mm-hmm. So people must have a sense of hope, a belief that life ultimately makes sense. And in a sense, that's where religion fits in, because religion fundamentally is the belief that life ultimately makes sense, that we are not cosmic accidents. On the other hand, poverty is physical. Poverty is to be deprived of adequate food and health care. It is to not have a job. It is to not have access to transportation and to communication. So for poor people in the country, they are deprived physically and mentally to the extent that some studies show that the longer you go to urban schools, the less you learn, the less education that you get. Poverty to the extent that a lot of young whites who have material goods but whose lives are full of chairs and not children, and whose lives have no meaning in them, begin to escape, and therefore they start pushing in the veins rather than pushing in the brains. And when they, take their false space trip on dope, they arrive back on the same airstrip, just a little deeper in debt, just a little more frustrated. They haven't left the problem, but the problem didn't leave, and problems are organic. They tend to grow. So, the problem is physical and mental.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, what kind of correlation, if you will, or relationship between the concept of poverty and between, for example, the program implemented under the Southern Christian Leadership Conference called Operation Breadbasket? What did that involve? Was that an offshoot of Dr. King's sincere concern about poverty in this country?
Well, that was one aspect of it. Dr. Leon Sullivan organized 400 ministers back nearly 10 years ago. They boycotted a couple of bread companies and a couple of major newspapers that were discriminating against black people. And they were successful enough to get meaningful concessions. And Dr. King talked with Dr. Sullivan. SCLC later adopted the program Operation Breadbasket. It basically deals with the consumer power of black people and challenges black people to buy together, save together, bank together, and unnecessarily boycott together. We must never underestimate the potential power of the American black economy. There are 25 million black Americans, which makes this group of black Americans the second largest African population in the world, second only to Nigeria. This 25 million black Americans has a gross national product of $42 billion. That would make us, if we were banking cooperatively, so to speak, the 16th richest nation on earth. It would make us the richest black nation on earth. That is a tremendous amount of wealth. If we boycott any given major company, we have more than its margin of profit, whether it's General Motors, Kellogg's Corn Flakes, General Foods, Maxwell House Coffee, or whoever it is. And to that extent, if we discipline our appetites and move with that kind of national power, we can, force the 500 major corporations to invest money in black education and to invest money in the redevelopment of the black community, just as was done for Japan and Germany, after World War II. So that concept, Dr. King shared with those of us on the staff, and we began to explore. And I still think it's a very meaningful concept. The concept has to take on flesh and blood and activity, but the concept is profound.
I remember having interviewed Reverend Sullivan several months ago, and as a matter of fact, I just left him about a month ago in Philadelphia. And it was quite surprising to me to know that he had, well, not really surprising, just lack of information. I was not aware that he had some association with SCLC. But here's a man, too, who has a profound sense of concern for the whole concept of economic development in the community.
See, what is interesting about Dr. King, at one time, I was just engrossed in the breadbasket boycotting concept, which is significant. We must have our productive end. We must have our black private economy. If we buy clothes, we must be able to make them and sell them to each other. If we eat, we should grow food. And if we wear shoes, we should sell them. And if we, make records, we should press them and distribute them and own black-oriented radio stations and black-oriented newspapers. But, you see, that is just one dimension of our community. That still, is a great mass of people who are part of the public economy. And they must have a job or an income, no matter where that job comes from, because black folk don't go to Vietnam and didn't go to Germany and didn't go to the Philippines based upon just the expectations of a community private economy. And to that extent, what is now, degradingly called welfare must be seen as a way for the people to fare well. And the government has an obligation to take care of the welfare of the people, or the people say farewell to that government. It is not just a job of black businessmen to create scholarships for black children to go to school, or to create basic, general good health conditions and good educational opportunities. So Dr. King went beyond just the private economy. So the Poor People's Campaign was about the bit of dealing with the whole of the base of the economy, pulling all of the needed together, the black, the white, the brown, all the races, male, female, the distraught, the left out, and change the fight from just a horizontal fight between poor black and poor white to a vertical fight between the greedy and the needy, so as to fight for a distribution, a proper distribution of wealth.
Why hasn't, we have been, I guess, taught one of the very basic and fundamental principles of economics, and that is the law of supply and demand, and if there's sufficient demand and so forth and so on, and sufficient supply, that there should be some sort of a control, there should be some sort of power, economic power, if the products are available. Why hasn't, in the black community, why hasn't there been that kind of power, that kind of control, where we tend to consume a significant percentage of the goods and services of the public economy, not to talk about the private? Why hasn't there been that significant kind of power?
Well, I think that we have spent so much of our time reacting to the prevailing power structure. And I don't say reacting in terms of condemning people who have been reacting. The scheme of the power structure has been not only to divide and conquer, but to keep us reacting on tangents. It took us from 1895 to 1954 to regain our legal position in terms of our base of support. But during the period when we were really fighting to regain our legal foundation, the time that would have been spent on economic development and economic consciousness had to be spent on the legal and the educational fight. Then we had to spend literally from 55 to 64 to get a public accommodations bill. So as to have enough respect in the public arena to get our minds together. In other words, if somebody will sit behind the curtain in a bus, they will not logically ask to sit in the front of the bus. But if they sit in the front of the bus, they may ask to drive the bus. And if they drive the bus, they will ask to get in the union. If they get in the union, they will ask, why not own the bus? If you talk about ownership, you start talking about politics, which controls ownership and begins to regulate laws and taxes and the whole bit. You see what I'm saying? So it took us 10 years to begin to regain a sense of social awareness. And then from 65 to 72, we had to regain enough political strength so as to be able to get the kind of contracts and the kind of sensitivity out of Washington where the major distribution of monies and goods and services take place. So in some sense, when one sees 3 black congressmen in 65, 13 in 72, perhaps 20 by November, no black mayors in 84, in 65, 84 black mayors now, 400 black elected officials in 65, 2,100 now, 1 U.S. senator, a black woman running for president, which is just 0.1% of the potential power that we deserve based upon our proportional strength. You see, we have been trapped reacting to the legal, the political, and the social situation. And that is why, in some sense, PUSH has come into existence saying that now we need a civil economics movement. We've had a civil rights movement. Some groups need to protect those civil rights. But now we have the right to move into any neighborhood in America, but we don't have the money to pay the notes. We have the right to go to any school in America, but we don't have the money to pay the tuition. We have the right to buy any car in America, and perhaps do buy any car in America, but we can't keep it but about 2 months because we can't make the payments. Because we're in the economic era. We must now go, from the lunch counter and move to being able to go to the bank to get the money to buy the whole lunch counter and the whole restaurant and the whole shopping center, and the whole complex. We must shift our fight just from the welfare department. If welfare is bad, then certainly more welfare is even worse. And to that extent, we have an obligation now to go to the Treasury Department, the Commerce Department, the Labor Department, the Office of Management and Budget. When Japan and Germany need total redevelopment, they didn't go to the American welfare system or the American Red Cross. They went to these major departments that deal with finance. And our problem, therefore, at this point in history is economic. The solution is economic, and the goal has to be economic. So this is really where we are now.
Now, what connection is there between economic power, economic development, and that thing we talk about, that political political man?
Really Siamese twins. When one considers that the major distributor of goods and services to the economic order is the political order. In other words, the major contracts are political. Whether or not you get licensed is political. The amount of taxes you pay or are able to avoid paying, is political. When the president August 15th could freeze wages and release prices, which indeed is political, he was saying the fact that all of the economy is public, therefore political. So as of that time, we officially moved away from capitalism into a political economy, where the political order, in fact, is able to jam or relieve the economy at any given point in time.
Mm-hmm. Let's back up a moment, and I want to touch upon your specific assignment in Operation Breadbasket. I want to talk about this in relation to your new efforts as well. What were the priorities in Operation Breadbasket?
Well, the priorities, as I said, was organizing a sense of economic consciousness around the nation, and I was about the business of putting together, various chapters and outlets. Later culminated in putting together an international black exposition, where we pulled black folk together from music, arts, culture, economics, politics, education, religion, into a one-week festival that we called Harambe, which meant, loosely translated, coming home together. To the Jews, it would mean Passover. It would mean the coming together of a people once a year in order to centralize our efforts and thereby go back across the country and come back again the next year and assess, where we are, to study where we have come from and to project into where we are going. And that is, the kind of dimensions that I was carrying it into before I left.
Were you involved in some boycott action directly in Chicago? You were headquartered in Chicago, weren't you?
Yeah, we were involved in, for example, when we confronted the A&P food chain and the National Tea food chain, our demands went something like this. We want the monies from the stores in the black community put in black banks. We want the stores in the black community to advertise in black media. We want the employees insured by a black insurance company. We want our black people in jobs, qualitative jobs, executive jobs, proportion to the number of black people that we have working here. We want black scavengers to pick up the garbage and black exterminators to kill the rats and the roaches. We want black builders to build the future stores. We want black produce managers and managers of these stores. And it was this kind of forcing by boycott these stores to do business with the black community that we began to pull the black business community together in some measure. Then we engaged in national boycotts. We hit Pilar Lard and demanded that they do the same thing. And when we began to hit Pilar Lard in 20 markets, a black legal firm now has a portion of the retainer of Pilar Lard. A black PR firm began to draw the PR outlets for Pilar Lard. North Carolina Mutual received a $4.5 million group insurance policy, which allowed it to hire more black people. And of course, all of this together, is evidence that when we stick together as a people economically, we can bring major giants to their knees, because the issue is not ownership as much as it is control. And we have more than the margin of profit of every major business in America.
How do you hope to consolidate, to unify, if you will? This seems to be a very significant and meaningful kind of term. You hear it all the time, unity. Is it a myth, or is it a very significant kind of concept that
I think we have to deal with unity, rather than uniformity. Uniformity would be to look alike, act alike, dress alike, talk alike. And we are not, a homogenous people. Each of us have our own personality, thank God. We're heterogeneous. We have many interests. Some are interested in the sciences, and others the arts, and others various forms of culture, and others politics, and others economics. And to that extent, we must look at NAA, Urban League, CORE, SCLC, NAACP, Panthers, various political groups, various athletic groups. And the challenge is to see each one of these as a string, and to orchestrate these sounds into a symphony for liberation. The challenge is not to make all of them one note, nor is the challenge to eliminate them, but rather to orchestrate them so that we can have a symphony. And there are enough, some of us will come off sharp, some will come off flat, and some will hit whole notes. But just so we remain on the scale, we can make a meaningful contribution to the music and the rhythm of our people.
Let's pause a moment. You're listening to the Black Studies Broadcast Journal, a production of the Black Studies Division in cooperation with the radio service of the Ohio State University's Telecommunications Center. This is WOSU AM, Columbus, Ohio. Reverend Jackson, how different is Operation People United to Save Humanity from Operation Breadbasket? Is there a difference?
I don't think that the issue is the difference, so much as it is the emphasis. Our emphasis is at one level the same, but at another level it's more direct. We're getting more involved now in confronting national companies and engaging in boycotts. We are right now negotiating with Schlitz Brewers out of Milwaukee and General Foods out of St. Paul, Minneapolis. And these companies have viciously discriminated against black people. They've locked us out of goods and services. And PUSH will be confronting them relative to the black private economy. Secondly, we will be involved directly in politics. We believe that to accept tax-exempt status, which means that we cannot take political positions, will not give us the freedom to take positions relative to Wallace, our McGovern, our Humphrey, our Shirley Chisholm, our Nixon. And to be locked out of the ability to discuss politics and to endorse candidates is to be locked out of relevancy.
Mm-hmm. Now, why don't we talk a little bit about the organizational vehicle that has been designed to aid you in the achievement of your goals and objectives and to the implementation of your philosophy and so forth. How is it structured? Is it conventional, or is it...
Well, in a sense, it's not conventional for a civil rights group in as much as we have, I guess, what you would call the Methodist structure. That is, we have a board of directors, and the staff, of course, is employed by that board. And
excuse me, how is this board, how is it?
It's interesting. We have a great cross-section of people. Jackie Robinson and Bill Russell from the athletic area, Quincy Jones from the music area, George Johnson and Johnny Johnson, Johnson Publishing Company, and George Johnson from Johnson Products Company, the business area. We have Dr. Roland Wiggins from University of Massachusetts, and Dr. James Cheeks from Howard, Dr. Charles Hurst from the educational area. So the attempt is to have a broad cross-section of folk. So when we talk about athletics or politics, where we have Richard Hatcher is on the board, Percy Sutton from New York, Carl Stokes is on the board. So when we talk about politics, I tend to relate to the politicians to find out where they are, what they see, to the economists and on around. So our board chairman is Reverend Clay Evans. Then we have a staff. Now, I'm president. Attorney Tom Todd, who is a law professor at Northwestern University, is the executive vice president. Leon Davis is our executive director. The reason why we took so much time to put together first-class people, capable, prepared people in these positions, is that if we, like we have Push East in New York now, we're getting ready to open up Push West in Los Angeles, and there are groups from Toledo and Columbus who are interested in setting up satellites of Push. Reverend Otis Moss from Cincinnati is our Midwestern vice president. We have a regional structure, of course, as well as a local structure. And we will not have what we call chapters, that is, isolated, autonomous groups who simply have the name of the organization, but do not have the organization's philosophy. Any affiliate will have the obligation to function with a sense of organizational oneness. We have a centralized treasury and a centralized board, and decisions are centralized because we cannot afford the looseness of organization, nor can we afford, or should I say, we must minimize the infiltration once we begin to step up our national boycotts and our political involvement.
Now, what about in every situation, there is always a need for some sort of catalyst, and I guess in this case I'm referring specifically to the finance. How do you intend to finance this effort?
At this point, we meet every Saturday morning. About 3,000 black people gather on South Side Chicago, and of course we take up collection, and our basic support comes from that source. But of course, during our exposition, we've been able to attract black artists. Aretha Franklin, Roberta Flack, The Temptations, Stevie Wonder, the Jackson 5, Quincy Jones, Cannonball Adderley, all of these persons come together once a year. And we have a 5-day festival. And the basic finances of our organization comes from this source. We can safely say that we have upwards of 95% of our money coming from black people. And that is what gives us the freedom to talk the kind of talk we talk and to attack the kind of people that we attack. Because we're not obligated to foundations, don't have any foundation money, ain't looking for none, because we want to be free enough to tell it.
What kind of efforts do you intend to implement in reference to other conventional and traditional civil rights-oriented organizations? Will there be any sort of cooperative efforts?
Well, certainly. We had a meeting with Brother Roy Wilkins 2 weeks after we were founded. In order to maintain a sense of rapport, we've had great personal rapport down through the years, and I have great respect for NAACP. As a matter of fact, I'm a member of NAACP. But when we had our family affair dinner, at which we had 10,000 people present, March 10th, I think it was, the week of the Gary Political Convention, we were able to, at that time, have as speakers that night Vernon Jordan from Urban League, Art Fletcher from United Negro College Fund, Dorothy Height from National Council of Negro Women, Dr. James Cheek from the educational area, Percy Sutton and Carl Stokes were the MCs. They were from the political area. Leron Bennett was the program chairman. Imamu Baraka, formerly known as Leroy Jones, was a part of the program. Well, the attempt to have this broad cross-section of persons, of course Lou Stokes was there from the caucus, was indicative of our attempt to pull together the maximum amount of black people from across organizational lines in order to develop what we call operational unity. And it has worked very effectively for us because we have gone out of our way to try to create this kind of relationship.
There's a question that's being constantly thrust at many men like yourself, and that is that for many years, the black Muslims in this country have attempted to develop economically in this country. Is what you're doing significantly different? Do you intend to unify your efforts, cooperate with the Muslims at all? I understand they have a large operation in Chicago.
Well, I met with the messenger 2 weeks ago. You know, we converse freely, and when we get together, we talk for 2 or 3 hours at a time. So we have an operational relationship. And the Muslims' headquarters was shot up in New York 3 weeks ago. I went to New York and met with Minister Farrakhan, had a press conference on their behalf, because we certainly are not in conflict.
Very, very professional people. I was there on Monday myself, and expect to have them here this week, Minister Farrakhan, the group.
I have a great deal of admiration for him. He's a very dynamic person. And I think that their being such a close-knit and disciplined organization is what has sustained them through, a period of misinformation about them and a lot of attacks upon them.
What do you foresee? As you know, we it seems to be a very exciting political year on the national scene. Do you intend to take any stands, any endorsements? How does the political picture look to you at this point?
Well, I see black people as perhaps playing a more significant role in this election than we've ever played in history. We have, of 25 million people, 14 million potential voters, 7.5 million black voters registered. And needless to say, it's a tragic that we have 6 million who are not registered. And in a sense, the voice must be expressed in vote. In 1960, President Kennedy beat President Nixon by 100,000 votes. Black people Southside Chicago were credited with being the margin of difference. Tragically, our political sophistication, or lack of it, was of such until we could not demand concessions in proportion to that contribution. In 1968, Mr. Nixon beat Mr. Humphrey by 500,000 votes. That suggests that the ideological difference between the candidates is so close until black folks certainly have the marginal difference in any given national election. Not 7.5 million voting together, but even 3 million or 2 million. In the last 2 instances, 1 million voting in one direction based upon enlightened self-interest could make the difference. I think that we now have, with the leadership of men such as Imam Baraka and Dick Hatcher and Lou Stokes and Charlie Diggs, the kind of political sophistication to demand concessions in proportion to this level of contribution to the party. That's what the whole black agenda is all about. So we will have one primary strategy, a strategy during the primary. Then we will have another strategy at the convention. And then another strategy in a general election. Politics are so dynamic, such a dynamic art, until one has to operate in periods and one has to deal with the existing alternatives. One cannot just be an abstract or an idealist. One must observe that which is and choose the most favorable alternative if survival is your priority, and certainly it is for us.
Have you, I guess it's always important for us, I think, to assist our black audience in some sort of more accurate assessment and evaluation of candidates. What do the candidates look like to you?
Well, at this time, one has to say for symbolic reasons, and for historical reasons, one certainly has to give Shirley Chisholm respect. But one has to see her as a symbolic candidate, in as much as, at this point, it's obvious she's not a viable candidate. Walter Fauntroy has 15 delegate votes. Carl Stokes has 8. And at this point, both of them have more delegate votes than Shirley Chisholm has. But in the race between Humphrey and McGovern, and it's coming down to that, one has to observe that Muskie and Humphrey, not only were they running partners in 1968, but they have a philosophical and a personal kinship. And so Muskie tossing in the towel is like giving us 2 for the price of 1. You get Humphrey and Muskie when you vote for Humphrey. They were appealing to the same voters. They were appealing to the same money. If Muskie had run in Ohio and had split some vote from Humphrey, McGovern would have won by a great margin. And it suggests that when Humphrey, if there's a showdown between Humphrey and McGovern with Muskie's support, he may be in a position to choose between McGovern, Wallace, and Shirley Chisholm for his running mate, at which time he probably would choose Muskie as the payoff for Muskie having thrown to him money and voters, you see. I think a Humphrey Musket ticket not only would not win, but it would not be worth winning. I don't think there's no significant value change there. I can't forget that the Mississippi Challenge in '64 and the Alabama Challenge in '68 were both unrecognized by Hubert Humphrey. I cannot forget when Dr. King took his position against the war in 1967 that Humphrey was a part of an administration and was party to, a move to declare that Dr. King had overstepped his boundaries. I cannot tell black people, based upon what Humphrey did in 1948, some speech he made, that we have any debt to him, in 1972. I am more inclined toward McGovern, far more inclined toward McGovern than Humphrey at this state of the game. In 1967, when Dr. King took his Vietnam War position, McGovern was the first national politician, a senator, to come to his rescue. Bobby Kennedy later joined the same position, which gave a certain level of international credibility to Dr. King's position. Secondly, McGovern's Senate Select Committee on Malnutrition and Human Need has had the effect of making the problem of hunger more visible and has had the effect of feeding more hungry people than any other committee out of Washington. Thirdly, his Rules Committee has opened up the convention to women and to black people and to Chicanos in a way that no other Rules Committee has ever. And fourthly, during the Florida busing showdown, when Humphrey was vacillating and operating from position to position, being what I call slick, McGovern never lost his integrity, even though he lost some votes. Nixon comes out talking about his anti-bus, but we know the issue was not anti-bus, it was anti-us. 42% of the children in America are bused every day, only 3% for racial reasons, so it has nothing to do with the yellow bus, it has something to do with black us. And so Humphrey simply said in the New York Times the next morning he's glad that Nixon finally joined his position. Of course, by that Monday, he had changed another position. I don't think that we can have an oscillating, vacillating, expedient man of words and not deeds in the White House if we can possibly help it. He certainly would be my alternative over President Nixon, but he certainly would not be my alternative over Senator McGovern. And black people do not know McGovern as well as they know Humphrey because he has not, been on the scene as long. And yet, there's no particular virtue in how long one has been on the scene. It has to be how well and how recent one has been on the scene.
It's very interesting. We've heard that black people are a very emotional people, and I'm wondering to what extent does the rhetoric play in this political campaign? As you know, Mr. Humphrey is a very emotional man and seems to have a great deal of fire behind his speeches. Should blacks be aware of this kind of...
Indeed. I think that black people are becoming more rational. I think that to the extent that we get involved in politics, we'll know more how the game goes. Just like up until 1964, the masses of black people were locked out of the political ballpark, if I may use this analogy anyway, out of the ballpark. We didn't know what was going down. 1968, after the 65 Voting Rights Bill, we were in the political ballpark, but it was the first time, for most black people, it was the first national political convention they'd ever gone to. And so we were in the stands looking at what was happening on the playing field. Much of it we didn't even understand. But by 1972, we are inside the arena, out of the stands, and we're down on the field, with the presidential candidate and others jockeying for positions of power. Conyers talking about Speaker of the House, Shirley Chisholm talking about President, and Walter Fauntroy and Carl Stokes talking about favorite son positions, and Julian Bond favorite son positions. So now that we understand the rules of the game and know that we have enough power to be real participants, one senses a growing sense of political sophistication on the part of black people. Our capacity to bargain is greater, and our knowledge of what to bargain for is greater. And so one has to say that black people cannot be ruled anymore just by putting a facade over our face or just by appealing to our emotions. I'm excitable, but I'm also rational. And sometimes, my emotions can drive my rationality as opposed to driving me crazy.
Reverend Jackson, there have been a lot of terms and labels placed upon blacks. In this, for instance, the speech department here at Ohio State University. I think one can be safe to say that it's all white, with except for two people who are black, whom duties are administrative rather than faculty-oriented. A couple of professors wrote a book called The Rhetoric of Black Americans. And in that book, a categorization of black people was made. Uh, One was the assimilated black man, the separatist, and the revolutionary. Assuming that these are viable and meaning kinds of categories, where wwould you place yourself? Where do you think you fall? Are you an assimilationist, an integrationist, or are each of these meaningful kinds of terms in
They're not
different
even meaningful to me.
situations?
I think they're white trick categories, you know. My first thing is that I am a human. I'm born into the human race. And I was not accepting the sub-race as my primary race, you know. You know, my ethnicity is black, my homeland is Africa. But I was born into the universe with all of the rights and privileges, therefore, that a human being should have. And to that extent, you know, in my blackness, I'm talking about chauvinism. That is, I glorify my heritage. But I'm not talking about racism, where I turn my race into a religion and negate other races. So to that extent, you know, I am, you know, a race chauvinist, not at the expense of other races, but just glorifying my own. And I'm not a male chauvinist at the extent of negating the role and the participation of women. I think that we must decide between race, sex, and ideas in terms of categories, and ideas is a more viable way of judging people than just by race or just by sex. Now, you know, beyond that, it is important for us to watch how white people talk about segregation, integration, disintegration, desegregation, assimilation, amalgamation, miscegenation. All these are various white sociological categories for their own convenience. I simply am a human demanding options and the freedom to be. There are times that I want to be just around black people based upon the fact that we have things in common. There are other times I want to be around theologians, some of whom may be white, because I want to discuss theology. I want the option to live in any neighborhood. I may choose to live basically where black people are living. But we need to know that when we live in an all-black area, it ain't because we made the decision to live there. The real estate board made the decision to live there by determining where else we did not have the option to live. And based upon more black people than property in a given area, supply and demand puts value on the slum property and makes our rent go up, and yet the quality of the property may very well be going down. You see what I mean? So segregation, I would have to be against that, because segregation is apartheid. Segregation is to be forced apart by law for the purpose of exploitation. So if I'm against apartheid in South Africa, where black folk do not have options, I got to be against apartheid in America. We're just fighting against a system that destroyed our options to get a house where we want to, our option to get education, our option to participate in athletics where we wanted to. On the other hand, the opposite of segregation is not integration. The opposite of segregation is desegregation, where we, by law, are not forced to live apart by law, but where we are revived with legal options to do what we want to do. Integration is a higher level where folks interrelate, where races interrelate voluntarily and by choice. Black folk are not integrated into Ohio State. We are desegregated into Ohio State. I mean, at this point, we do not want to, integration presupposes that an inferior group wants to melt into a superior group and thereby melt away and lose its identity. We don't want to integrate, we want to interrelate, where we share the best of our culture one with the other. More than speaking of America as a melting pot, one must see America better as a bowl of soup. You don't see, blacks and Italians and Jews and Greeks melting and coming out with some new hybrid race. But rather what you see, is this bowl, which would be America, and the soup would be our common experiences and our common environment. And in the bowl of soup, you see a pea and a bean and a piece of meat and various other elements. You don't, mash those elements together. Each one has its identity, but its base is the bowl of soup. What has happened for too long is that the black element in that soup, which has given it music and art and science and skill and hard work, the black element has been in the bottom of the bowl. So we did a lot of work and did a lot of contributing, but we had no visibility. And what we're saying now is that either you give us our share of visibility, or we're willing to help turn over the bowl of soup so nobody will be comfortable. We're going to redistribute the pain if we can't redistribute the wealth. Now, I don't know whether this makes one sound revolutionary or not, but I know that revolution, the only difference between revolution and evolution is timing. Both are going in the same direction. And I am certainly going in the direction of a new value system and a new way of looking at and respecting people. I do not think to identify with a rifle is to make you a revolutionary. It may mean that you have not identified your enemy just as you've identified your friends. You may be going from genocide to suicide because in knowing your desires, you have not assessed, and thereby you don't have knowledge of your enemy. So we can't say the man is going to kill us by genocide, and then we run from genocide and go to the police headquarters with a bottle of liquor and alcohol, and run from genocide to suicide and maybe get stopped by homicide and fratricide in between. Where we either get killed going too fast in the car or we get killed through fratricide ripping each other off because of frustration and confusion. You see what I'm saying?
Sure.
So I don't have to call myself segregationist or integrationist. I call myself a liberationist who is a human being demanding my options, my chance to participate in whatever I want to participate based upon how I feel is really what I desire for myself and other people in the world.
Following that, we've talked a little bit in economic and political veins. What about, let's move into the area of education, higher education specifically. Over the last few years, we've seen the development of Black Studies, Afro-American Studies programs around the country. Do you see this as a viable kind of option? Do you see it as being a significant Black presence on the campus?
If it is not academically castrated. In other words, we must have a balance between Black history, where we came from, and a knowledge of our historical self, a sense of psychological self-realization, to know that we have a heritage, but then we must have the capacity to assess our Black present and to project our Black future. In other words, we've got to be as concerned, if not more so, about a Black future than we are just Black history. Because, the self-hatred proposition assumes that self-love will solve our problem. But suppose you go from self-hatred to self-love and don't have the money to go to Ohio State, you can't get an education. To have self-love in a house and the roof is not on it. If it's rained, you're going to get wet. So we need more than just a psychological change from self-hate to self-love. We need, a certain concrete economic and political fulfillment. We need to have the intellectual capacity to exploit the land for man, to turn greasy water into oil, and to turn trees into lumber, and to turn sand into bricks. An undeveloped mind will see a brick, and in that brick he will see destruction, and he will throw it. A developed mind will see a brick, and in it he will see construction, and he will lay it if his mind is developed. And so I do not want us to deal with a Black Studies that castrates us academically. Furthermore, we must, if we're going to be revolutionary and relevant, we must assess what the Black community is deficient in. Go to school and get the information and come back and offset that deficiency. In other words, if we're going to deal with Black health, whether it's sickle cell, cold, or cancer, we must say that we should have one Black doctor per 1,000 people, and now we have one Black doctor per, 30 or 40,000 people. So if you're going to be a revolutionary, it may mean going to med school if you're going to heal the sick. Or if liberating the captive is what you see, it may mean either going to law school so you can argue before the court, or it may mean dealing with political science, becoming a politician so you can appoint the judges and get people, liberated directly. You follow what I'm saying?
Sure.
If you're going to deal with the fact that Black people are cheated in stores, maybe you need to learn how to run a store. Because to learn the science of finance is revolutionary. Castro not only ran Batista out, but he ran a new regime in that was capable of running the nation. And if we run white folk out the ghetto and cannot run Black folk in the ghetto, then a thing called the counter-revolution will set in. But people will say that, now that you have taken us away from Egypt, now you got us out here in the desert, and you can't feed us anything but, but raw leaves and rain. So to that extent, there's a profound challenge for young Black students who are in school to study ourselves psychologically, but also to study the concrete objective deficiencies in the Black community so we can have our bank and our radio station, so we can build our buildings, our schools, our houses, our churches, exploit our land, and protect ourselves.
Now, this requires a very highly interdisciplinary oriented program, doesn't it?
Indeed it does.
Yes.
That's why I said it cannot be academically castrated, where you just go and spend a lot of time dealing in studies that should be your avocation rather than just your vocation. In other words, you can read the books of Brother Lerone Bennett while some of us are playing whist. Or you can read the autobiography of Malcolm X and the books about Dr. King. A lot of that we can read if we are serious about it, during time that we are now spending and shucking and jiving and just complaining and being on each other's back. That we should come to the university, it seems to me, to get uncommon information. I mean, you just don't have many chemistry and physics labs in the black community. You just don't have many buildings where you can get architectural science, or medical information, or information about political science, or information about, oceanography or moonography, for that matter. And one should exploit this opportunity to come to the university to get uncommon information. And to that extent, one would be taking the best of our black heritage and moving us on toward our black future.
Very beautifully articulated. And in our last minute remaining, Reverend Jackson, what do you have you set for your goals in the immediate future? What do you intend to do?
In the immediate future, we intend to have 20 push satellites around the nation, where we can have a web and a network of black people who have enough economic consciousness to be able to move simultaneously and immediately and collectively on a given target that is exploiting us. Some of our targets will include the 500 major corporations that are listed that certainly are soliciting black support in terms of cheap labor, in terms of consumer power, where we are marginal profit of their major companies. We shall begin to move, and in every sense of the word, move toward nation time. And nation time certainly means that joining hands across city, county, and state lines, ultimately across national lines. And I certainly want to thank you for giving us the opportunity to sit with you for an hour today and to express ourselves. And I certainly challenge young blacks to go beyond a new symbol and begin to deal with a new substance. And it won't do for us just to have processed, to remove the process from our hair and then keep process on our brains and to keep all of the contempt and the bitterness toward each other and the resentment built up. And certainly to exploit the chance to go to school and not just to check out our hairstyle, but to check out our minds, because I think freedom is ultimately is in the mind. It's bad to live in the slum, but it's far worse to have the slum living in you.
I'd like to thank you very much, Reverend Jackson, for appearing on the Black Studies Broadcast Journal. And perhaps in the near future, perhaps next year during our lecture series, we'll extend to you another invitation to come to the campus and speak to our students and again appear on the Black Studies Broadcast Journal.
Right on.
Thank you very much. And we cordially invite our listeners to address any correspondence to the Black Studies Broadcast Journal in care of Radio WOSU, 2400 Olentangy River Road, Columbus, Ohio, 43210.
Incidentally, those who want to join Operation Push can write you, and they will be able to get push cards in order to affiliate with the organization.
Exactly. Beautifully. So until next Saturday, we want to invite you to tune us in and have a very good week. And the reproduction, duplication of any portions of this program without the express written permission of the Black Studies Division is prohibited. Have a good day.